This episode of Troxel is supported by Avail. Content is more than Revit families. If it's digital, Avail can handle it. Learn more at getavail.com. Welcome to the Troxel Podcast. I'm Evan Troxel. This is the podcast where I have a conversation with guests from the architectural community and beyond to talk about the coevolution of architecture and technology. In this episode, I welcome Michael Ermann. Michael is a full tenured professor at Virginia Tech, where he teaches design studio, building systems, and materials and methods of construction. He's also the creator of Amber Book's animated architecture licensure prep. He's won 14 awards for his research, teaching, and design work, including 2 design awards for an edition made from bubble wrap that he put on his own house. In this episode, we discuss intuition, meaning, the necessity for architects to go deep, how the profession is ignoring the market forces, and we have a critical conversation about architectural education and practice. This was a fantastic conversation with Michael, and I hope that you'll not only find value in it for yourself, but that you'll help add value to the profession that we all love by sharing it with your network. In addition, if you are enjoying the show, I hope you'll leave a 5-star rating and a review on Apple Podcasts. It really does help support the show, and it helps broaden the reach of conversations like these in my attempt to elevate the industry. I would also appreciate you visiting the sponsors who are helping to make this episode possible. And so without further ado, I bring you Michael Ermann. Michael, welcome. It's great to see you.
Thank you, Evan. It is good to see you.
Yeah, I think the last time we connected in Chicago, obviously, that was really cool to meet you there for the first time. And I found out that you've been listening to my other podcast for quite a while. So that was exciting for me too, because I'm definitely aware of you in the architectural world as well. So that was a great time to actually meet you.
Long-time listener, first-time caller, Evan.
Yeah.
So I think if you remember right, I think I was just telling you that I'm an acoustician by trade, and that's my training and my background. I'm an architectural acoustician. And just then I was at drumline, and a high school drumline started coming by and drowned us out. So we never got to talk.
That's right. We were attempting to record an interview in the booth. Yeah. And then the drumline came by, and it was like, yeah, these acoustics, it's just not working for us. So Michael, tell us, you are a man of many things. You're kind of a Renaissance man, I guess, in that kind of way of thinking. You've got your teaching, you've got the Amber Book. I'm sure I know you're doing projects as well. I saw this amazing project that you showed me, the glass house. So give us an idea of who you are, where you're coming from, what you're doing.
Oh, sure. You're very kind. I don't know if I'm so much of a Renaissance man. I think of myself more as like, you know how when a rapper talks or sings, they're always talking about how they had all these doubters. Like they're always trying to prove the doubters wrong, right? So like whenever I feel like I'm getting pigeonholed in one area, I tend to have like an instinctual, I don't know, every 10 years or so, I'll change my, I could do that too. I have an architecture degree and I'm a licensed architect and I love design. That's my first love. But when I was in architecture school, I was also studying architectural acoustics, and I was super interested in that. But I also was interested in not being pigeonholed, and I always felt the whole time like I had to prove that I wasn't just the tech guy. And I don't believe that I don't believe in the fiction that you have to be either kind of math oriented or design oriented. You can I see no reason why you can't do both. And actually, I see lots of people who are both in my classes at Virginia Tech, where I teach architecture and have for this is my 22nd year. And we can get into that. Oh, let's just get into that now, Evan. So like if you kind of think of if you think of one of those kind of like 4 boxes where you have like on the y-axis, maybe you have more or less math oriented, and on the x-axis you have more or less design oriented. And I know by doing this, I'm betraying I'm showing my math orientation, but there's 4 quadrants, right? There's people who are engineering oriented and people who are and not design oriented. There are people who are both. There are people who are neither. There are people who are the other one, whatever. And so I think what winds up happening is you look at that, and in my experience, I found people get distributed in all four boxes. So you have people who are good at both. You have people who are good at design but not engineering, people who are strong in engineering but not design, and people who are weak at both. And the ones who are weak at both kind of keep quiet. So, they kind of fade away. And so 2/3 of the remaining are in the strong in design and weak in engineering, or strong in engineering and weak in design. And so they say, oh, you have to be good in one or the other because it fits their worldview. But actually, I have found that it scatters pretty nicely. But anyhow, so I just, all I wanted to do was show that I really could do design, and I really was kind of into that stuff. And then I went and took a job I got some job offers both for architecture firms and for acoustics firms. And I took the job at an acoustics firm, and I was in their architecture department. I was so excited to be the architecture guy in the acoustics firm until I got there and I realized that was kind of a glorified drafting job. And I knew how to do the acoustic stuff, but no one really knew that. So then I wound up swinging the other way, right? Now, kind of tell people whenever they'd listen that I was good at the other stuff. And then I was good at acoustics, and I kind of did that. And then I came to teaching here at Virginia Tech, and I was pigeonholed at first as a, building systems professor. And then I kind of swung back the other way again and said, no, I can do the design stuff too. So I would say it's more comes from a place of insecurity than a place of confidence as a Renaissance man.
Interesting.
But so I was an acoustician for some years. I'm an architect and licensed architect. We make animations for folks who are studying for the building for the architect's licensure registration exam, the licensure exam for architects.
Yeah, there's so many things in there that one of the things I think we were having a back and forth on when we were in Chicago was this idea about expertise versus generalists, right? You've got the experts and the generalists. And what's interesting is, and I was kind of pushing more on the generalist side, and you were like pushing back into the expertise side.
I call it the myth of the noble generalist. Go ahead, finish what you're saying.
Well, I'm just thinking like that this idea of these quadrants really starts to get you into more of the expertise thing, and the closer you are to maybe the center of that entire thing, like you can dabble in all these different things and be good enough to be dangerous in those. And that probably falls more into the category of generalists.
I think that's fair. I think, everything I just told you kind of implies that I would like to be seen as a generalist.
Uh-huh.
But in defense, but in defense of specialists, if we look at any other profession, if you, God forbid, got, I don't know, prostate cancer, you would go to the urological oncologist. You wouldn't go to your family doctor. Every other profession has moved towards specialists. And so it is a little bit of kind of the typical architect's hubris to be like, no, but except for us, like even as buildings get more and more complex, and as the technology that designs them and runs them gets more and more complex, we somehow have lamented some lost time when we were when we were in charge of everything. But the doctors used to be one family doctor in the town that was in charge of your prostate cancer, and it's not that way anymore. And so, I would just push back on the idea that there's something noble specifically about being a generalist, despite the fact that I just kind of push for shaping my narrative so that I'm seen as a generalist who can bounce back and forth.
Well, the interesting thing to me about it is I think you need all of it, right? And especially in a larger firm where you're doing these massive projects that are highly technical, very complex. And you do need, it's funny, you look at the roster of who's on the team, and there are so many consultants, right? You've got the acoustics consultant, you've got the technology consultant, you've got all the different engineering disciplines, you've got, environmental consultant. Depending on where the project is, you could have a completely different set of consultants from this project to that project. And I think architects are a little bit averse to that risk, right? I mean, that's in air quotes, because we're a lot averse to all those risks of knowing all of those things. And so you're teaching at Virginia Tech, you're teaching these students, and a lot of the schools are design schools. They're teaching people to become design specialists. And there are very few design positions in the world of architecture when it comes down to it, unless you're going to start your own firm, and then you're going to become a generalist, right? Because you're going to do it all. Or you're going to hire a team that comes in and fills in those pockets that you're missing on. Because I know one thing is that it's torture for me to have to do accounting, right? As an example, or project management, but I want to do design because that's what I'm really good at. And the other stuff really degrades my quality of life. And so I actually do want to hire somebody who's passionate about that because they're going to fire on all cylinders in that expertise. So it is, I do think you need all of it. I just don't, it's so hard in an educational system to teach for one of those things or for two or three of those things when it's actually like on these teams, there's just so many.
That's a good point. I mean, probably the thing that all of those consultants have in common is they're all brought in too late in the design process to be as much as to be as helpful as they probably should be. Right. And it's not because it's not because I don't believe that it's because the architect doesn't want the legal risk. It's because the architect wants to design it without the input of all these people because design by committee.
Well,
sucks,
there's
right?
that too.
It sucks as a process and it sucks as a product. And so we want to be in control of it. And what we want to do is we want to tell the lighting consultant to make it work afterward. And we want to tell the code consultant to make it work afterward. And certainly the acoustical consultant to make it work afterward. And so this is one of the kind of, I don't know if it's a minor or major challenge for the profession as I see it is, if you're going to pay all these people, bring them in early enough to do good, but how do you do that and still, keep control? And I got to think that architects, because like you were talking about, like, I don't like project management either. I hate project management and I don't really like accounting that much either. And so, I see where you're coming from for sure. I wonder if we're going to, it's a fascinating thing because as architects and certainly as educators in the academy, we're always kind of saying, look, don't be nostalgic when it comes to form making. We're all, I think almost every one of your listeners who, maybe didn't graduate from Miami or Notre Dame would be on board with that idea that, we should not be nostalgic for form making in architecture. We don't need any more faux castles or, neo-colonial. But somehow it's okay to be nostalgic for this, this kind of bygone era where the architect was in charge of everything, which I frankly doubt. I'm not sure how long that era lasted, frankly. And moreover, where for some reason also, and just kind of as a somewhat aside, we're encouraged to be kind of nostalgic for some fictional era that existed, but it never did exist, where walls in particular were one thing all the way through. So there's this kind of like, if it's, if it's concrete all the way through, then, it's honest and it's showing the same thing on both sides. But there's several problems with that idea of stone or, this kind of like, it's a trap, right? So it's a trap for several reasons. One is there never was that era. If you look at how Roman construction happened, they'd have masonry and two widths of masonry, and they'd put fill in the middle, and it looked like it was the same thing all the way across. Or if you look at a detail of an Ondo building now, it's two pours of concrete, and there's insulation in between it. But there's great effort that goes to hiding that fact. And so the idea that these things are completely honest or something, and that somehow there was a time when there was that purity. And then just to kind of, take it one step farther, I'm a little disappointed that architects' fixation on the wall anyway, especially the exterior wall, because it's one of the only times where the architect gets fooled in the same way the layperson does, where you're saying like, look, a layperson will say, oh, that's a brick house or that's a stone house or a metal building. And architects will do that too. And we'll kind of ignore if a building thought of itself, I think it would think of itself as a foundation and a roof. There's so much more problems that can happen. And, yet the architect is always kind of fixated on the exterior finish of the wall. But I kind of get that too, because of the outsized role in elevation. You
totally sparked a memory in my brain when talking about the hiding stuff and like going to great lengths to hide the fact that these things are made up of really complex assemblies of different materials. And then you go through all this rigmarole to make it look like one thing when it's actually quite a few other things. But I remember specifically on a large higher education project, and that the client did not want to see the structure anywhere. And it was a brace frame building. So, you can kind of understand why at some point, like they don't want to see the braces, but like columns, anything. And going through the great lengths of these enormous cavity walls to hide the structure just to appease one person on the administration of that college who is never going to be inside that building, like never, right? They're not the user and they're just on the kind of in the approval process as a stakeholder. It's really interesting to see the pressures on architects to please their clients and provide the service that their client is paying for some thing that's basically equivalent to like, I don't like purple, right? It's really interesting to see all these various pressures on architects to do things that go beyond like what the architect would do, but it's really about synthesizing all of the inputs from all the people in the jurisdictions, the HJs, the site, the environment, like everything into one final solution. And how like, man, this seriously is a team sport. But not only is it a team sport from the people doing the work, but also for like taking the input from various other teams to make that thing a reality. It's crazy. It's actually crazy that it happens at all. It's so complex.
That's super interesting. It actually might be a fun, I know it's kind of limiting from an architecture design point of view, but that may be a fun design prompt from a studio, an architecture studio point of view. I'm always looking for ways to reduce the number of variables. If you have a big, like right now, I'm assigning a fairly big project, and the students are, it's an integrative studio. So the students are responsible for not only design, but also for structure and materials and methods of assembly, and for building systems and for materiality and for code research and so forth. And, I really work hard to kind of, back to that generalist idea, I work hard to kind of make the project so that there's an expectation that it's necessary but not sufficient to design, to code, and to, with a reasonable structural partie, but that you'll be evaluated. Your goal is to make something beautiful, even though it has to work. But having to work, you don't get any points for having to work. But in order to do that, if I'm going to say,
that's table stakes,
right, it's table stakes. It's exactly right. That's a really good way to put it. I think I may use that. And so it's table stakes to make sure it all works, and then it has to be beautiful. That's what you're going to be evaluated on, or meaningful, or iterative, or there has to be an intensity, or there has to be an intention. There needs to be something. There needs to be something there, or many things there, that give it meaning. And kind of giving meaning in a complex world might be the best way to describe what we do. And so when you do that, as you were talking about these teams of people that are assigned to make a project, but now you're taking a student who has less experience than a practitioner, obviously, and you're saying, okay, in 15 weeks, and you have other courses too, but in 15 weeks, we want you at the most, that's if you only have one assignment during that semester, we want you to make a building that does all those things, and that not only does all those things, but can convey all those things. And that is beautiful. And so one of the ways I've been able to do that, I think fairly successfully, is to create limitations of any kind, so that people aren't struggling with, they can make something beautiful without having to decide. For instance, so the project that my current studio is assigned is, it's a slot building. So the form is decided. It's a zero lot line slot building. So, and it's got a limited height. So it's, the box is decided. So then, it becomes about the overhead plane and the sectional quality and the spatial quality, the details and the elevation and kind of, how it fits in from an urbanistic point of view, daylighting, that kind of thing. So I can kind of control that. And the idea of saying, okay, the client wants you to, wants to make the structure invisible, maybe a little bit liberating in some ways. In that context. That's super interesting.
I had that exact same project when I was in second year. It was an infill project, so the box was defined. The client was an artist. You could pick what kind of artist they were. They could be a sculpturist, they could be glass, whatever it is. And then you would design. And I remember the case studies were Adolf Loos because of the sectional quality that you mentioned, right? It's like coming up with ways to get daylighting deep into the building. All of those things that you just mentioned. It's so like these things don't really, like, the problems are still the problems. That's interesting that there's, and what's also interesting about that project, I thought, because it's vivid in my mind, is how many possibilities there are. Oh my, everybody's going to come up with a different solution every semester, every year for 30 years, and you're never going to see the same thing twice. It's so interesting.
It's true. That's why I'm a big fan of intuition as an expression of architecture, because what will happen is students, and frankly professionals, they'll become post hoc lawyers after the fact, kind of deciding what the true reason they make it. They think they have to make an excuse for a reason for every move they made. And in reality, that's ridiculous. You can't possibly, you're making, at the early stages of the design, you're making, I don't know what, 200,000-300,000 decisions a minute, in the first couple hours of a project. And there's no way to have a
even if you don't think you are.
Of course you are.
You're
it's like
designing something
driving
now that has so many. Yeah.
Yeah. Even when you're driving, you're making probably a few hundred decisions a second, So the idea that somehow we need to and in school especially, that this kind of ridiculous idea that we need to have a justification for every single move we make is insane. It's not only insane, it's dishonest, because those who do have those justifications, they did it for other reasons, often intuition and or often expediency, or often they just weren't thinking of a third option, and then they after the fact go in and say, this is why I did it. But of course that's ridiculous. So I kind of embrace the idea that we ought to have a direction. There ought to be about a set of design priorities. This project is about about where daylight and structure meet, or this project is about verticality and dematerialization, or whatever the kind of idea, the architectural idea is. I think a lot of times a project can be about something that's really hard to put into words. Maybe you show an image of a painting or of another a piece of architecture work, or a piece of industrial design, and you say, this is what this project's about. It's kind of this this idea of these interlocking pieces, but it's not really interlocking in terms of the word interlocking. It's much more like this. And you show, some detail that Zumthor did in some railing or something. And then that becomes what the idea of the project is. So I'm not suggesting that it's super important that there be a driver, a thesis, an idea, an intention driving your project. So I think that's super important, especially in a big project where you have lots of people working on it. Everyone has to be working the same, rowing in the same direction. I'm suggesting that the decision to put the balcony on, on this window and not that window, there does not have to be a reason behind that. There just has to be an idea that there's going to be outdoor living incorporated into the facade of the building, and that's good enough. And you don't have to then take that to, well, it's going to be on this one because when you're approaching the building from this side, that's ridiculous. It's usually not true. It's usually just added on after the fact.
It's a great point. I think this idea of the celebrating kind of that intuition is also important. And that doesn't seem to happen a whole lot because we live in a world where everything must be justified. And I think that's only getting more and more so, right? Because we look at all the software that's being developed for environmental, analysis on projects. And basically it gets to the point where if you don't make a reason for it, it's going to get VE'd out of the real building, right? When it's a real project. And so I remember a same project as the one I was just speaking about the structure. It was like we had these shading fins on the exterior of the building. They were the very first target under the VE kind of line items. Like, let's get rid of those things, right? And it was like, well, you can't, because the energy model now depends on them. And like, I totally did that on purpose, right? Because I never wanted those things to go away. And so we tied it to a justifiable reason why they could not go away. And we had to cut somewhere else. Man, the balancing act that is architecture is pretty insane. And so I really love your idea, though, of saying you can't define the idea with a word necessarily. I like this idea of being able to explain it with a picture, because architecture isn't all about the check boxes that say it does this, it does this, it does this. It is the meaningful feeling that people get when they use the building. I hope that's real architecture. It's something that not only performs, but it also gives meaning. And can every building do that? Of course not. Can every space in a building do that? Probably not, right? So, but there are moments where, and I think that's what you kind of get good at as you become an architect, at least the ones who do a lot of buildings, right? Not just the special cases for the ultra rich, but you do have moments in buildings where there's a lot of benign space. And then there are these moments that you pass through and that you see and that you experience. And then they do give meaning to your day-to-day life on campus or in that office or whatever those things are, that still makes that building have an impact on you and the community and the user groups and all of those things. But can it be everything all the time? I don't think so. That's not the world we live in either, for the most part. Public buildings more so than not.
Yeah, I mean, to the listener of this podcast, if you work in a firm of at least 10 people and you can't identify the box checker in your firm, then you are the box checker in your firm. I mean, box checking, there's nothing worse than box checking, right? Because it's a misappropriation of the concept of efficiency, as if beauty has no value just because we can't quantify it easily. So you don't want to fall sucker to the fallacy that if it can't be measured easily, it doesn't have value. or if it can't be given a number concretely, it doesn't have value. But to your point about the fins, that's super interesting on two levels, because on one level, it's interesting because that is always the challenge, and probably always has been the challenge, is to make something, as you did in that example, make something so integrated into the design that it can't be easily VE'd out, where there's not going to be a line item that someone can just cross out and, show their boss, look, I just saved $75,000 by not having these armatures to hold up the fins coming out of the building. But the second, trying to figure out, and I love the way you did it, kind of saying, well, the whole energy model depends on it. That's really interesting. Usually what I hear is, trying to make it so that basically you can't imagine the building without it, right? The fins are also the radio antenna or something like that's in the program. But there's this kind of like, maybe this like, I don't know, this kind of second layer where the promise was always that the promise of BIM was always that, okay, we, the designers, are going to give you the software, because the software is now going to have basically a spreadsheet behind it. We're not going to be designing in a spreadsheet. We can't see it, but there's a spreadsheet, right? So we're giving some of the control over. And the promise was always that in return, we were going to get some information back in real time as we designed. And man, did that second part of the promise take a long time to come. And even still, it's really disappointing to me. I mean, it should be easier than it is when you're designing in BIM to make a decision and to see in real time what the energy or cost impact or code impact is going to be in that project. And it's been really, at least from my point of view on the academy side, I'm not steeped in the everyday profession as much as I would like to be, but I have been really disappointed that we have given up a whole bunch of decisions to the default of the BIM model, of the BIM software, rather, not even the model, the BIM software. But we have not, it's taken a while, and we're only just now finally starting to get in return something where we can make a decision to say, oh, if I put this window over here instead on this wall instead of that wall, look at that. That saves, X BTUs per year, or kilobTUs per year,
yeah.
I guess.
Get technical. I feel like that the BIM software forces you to make so many decisions so early that the kind of things that you're talking about, you're not ready to make those decisions yet. And I mean, in some cases, yeah, you totally want to be able to quantify it, but at the same time, you don't know what those things are yet. And does the model know what's inside and outside? Sometimes, right? And so exterior materials versus interior materials, I mean, it's like, there's so many times as an architect when you show it to the client in black and white because you don't want to talk about color or materiality yet. But at the same time, they want to know how much it costs. And it's like, we don't even know what it is yet, right? And so there is kind of this constant tug of war internally about what do we could be 3 steps ahead, and we dial it back to show them because we're not ready to go there yet. We haven't made these we haven't run these other decisions through the process yet that we've kind of made internally, and we're throwing it over the net to say, what do you think? Because whatever they think is going to re-impact where we're at. It is an iterative kind of looping process. Yeah.
Super interesting. So you're saying that those in the profession are being forced to make decisions and then keep it, but they're tentative decisions for cost, or just because the software wants them, and you're like, all right, it's drywall for now.
Generic walls. Yeah.
And then generic wall, right. Generic walls. I wonder if there's a software solution to that, because that does seem like something where you could imagine a world where the software could, where artificial intelligence, could kind of make decisions for you that you can change later. Again, the problem with that, of course, is every placeholder always winds up being permanent. I mean, like, unless there's pushback from a structural engineer or something like that.
That's a great term.
But these placeholders always wind up becoming permanent. So you say, well, I'm not sure what I'm going to do with that room. I'm just going to do it like this, and I'll come back to it. But everything else all the other puzzle pieces kind of work around it. And you're like, well, and you don't even think about it. Well,
they build on top of that. Yeah, they build on top of it, and then you can't change it.
Right?
Yeah. It is kind of an interesting problem. I mean, let's talk about the idea of software in school. So before we hit record, you were talking about like Virginia Tech's approach to teaching or not teaching software. And I know a lot of schools are kind of constantly reevaluating what they should teach versus what they shouldn't, and why, right? And you had maybe 4 different reasons about kind of why things are the way they are. Maybe could you go through those?
Sure, of course. I mean, of course, when when we speak to people in the profession, they're very keen on having us train people for their first year. So, they want us to do the training. And in fact, if you were to look on the job boards right now, you would see a lot of openings for architects with 3 years minimum experience because they want someone else to train the architects. It's a huge problem in the profession, and it's a market forces issue. It's not. I don't think it's necessarily evil architecture firms, but as a profession, I would think that we have got to get a little bit better at kind of incorporating some of the training in, as part of the business model, and not kind of, leaving it to other people to train your architects that you want to hire. But yeah, there are at least four problems with that model of saying we want the architecture schools to do the work of training the architects in our, in this case right now would typically be Revit. And the first is that we're not as good as the firms at training people in software. I mean, we will never be as good as the firms at training people in software, because software, just like will never be as good at training people in pro practice. Because if you're not dealing with contracts, or you're not dealing with the software every day, if you're not kind of working the software, if you're just learning it in the absence of something specific, it becomes quite inductive. It's a kind of a general to specific way to teach, and that's not how we learn. We learn by going from the specific to the general. So if you go to a firm and you say, okay, you have to do it in BIM and go, that's the best way to learn BIM. So that's the first problem, is that we're not as good as the firms. The second problem is, if I were to line up every project at Virginia Tech, you could probably almost without fail identify the students who started in BIM. They'd be among the weakest projects, because there's this kind of, with BIM, like we just talked about, there's so much of the design that's given over to the default. Students especially don't know how the gutter, how the rafter tail should end and the gutter detail should begin and the roof. And so they'll take the default. And of course, that default may make that rafter split because it's exposed, with a really acute angle on it. But the student doesn't even know to think about, that it maybe that rafter is taken down at a 90-degree angle to the rafter instead of vertically. So there's that issue as well, is that you get weak work when you tell students to design, and frankly, that's true in the profession too. I mean, when I'm king, there's going to be a requirement that every architecture project should have to start with a physical model made of at least cardboard, chipboard, something, because there is an element to designing in the softwares that we have right now, anyway, most of them, where you're designing in plan and then you're extruding up, and so you wind up with these kind of plan-centered projects that, in reality, most of the experience of being in a building is really not related to plan. Plan's actually quite boring. Plan's great for telling a contractor where to put things, but our buildings go up very much in plan. But the way we experience buildings is much more in elevation and overhead plane and spatial and haptic qualities and sectional qualities and so forth. So you can spot a Revit project from a million miles away within the academy. Number three, we're generally angled toward, and I think our highest use is kind of train. If we're insofar as we're training people for the practice, is probably for people between the 5th and the 15th year of practice. So the first 5 years is time to kind of learn code, learn how to be a professional, learn the software, learn the different what goes into a drawing set and so forth. But years 5 through 15, you're making decisions about space and form and light and materiality and durability and so forth. And that's really where we're best at. And then, maybe after year 15, you're spending a lot of your time in meetings with clients, or, doing business development or contracts or something like that. So our highest use is in that middle section of a career. I don't remember what I said for number 4.
I don't remember either, but it doesn't really matter at this point. Like there are a lot of reasons why it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, no, I remember what the 4th one I told you was. So I have had on multiple occasions, and I can go through the specifics if there's time for that. But where I've talked to students, I mean, I had a situation here. Let me tell you a story. So I had a situation in 2009. I took my students to Raleigh, and we visited a student who had graduated the year before, and at her firm. And she worked at a fairly large firm, and it was 2009, so everyone was getting laid off. And I kind of pulled her aside during the tour, and I said, are you in danger of being laid off?" And her name is Chelsea. Chelsea said, "No, are you kidding? I'll be the last person they lay off. I know Revit better than anyone else here." And it floored me because a year earlier, she had never used anything digitally. I was her thesis advisor. I worked with her for a full year. I never saw her open a computer. She only hand drew everything. She hand drew everything. And I said, "But I thought, but you were the Luddite. You were the one who didn't use any technology." And she said, "Yeah, exactly. So when I came here, when there was a project due and and everyone was under the gun for the deadline, everyone who knew AutoCAD just went back to AutoCAD. But I didn't know AutoCAD or Revit, so I had to learn one or the other. I obviously was going to learn Revit. That's where everything was going. So now I'm the Revit expert in the firm." Same thing happened a year later. I took the students to New York. Same exact situation with a student who hadn't done anything digital, and he was as a KPF. He was the digital maven at KPF. 2 years earlier, he hadn't done a bit of digital work on his full year thesis. Not a bit. It was all hand drawn, and it was because he went there and he knew how to use Rhino, and he knew how to. He had learned all that stuff because he had to learn something, and so he learned the latest. So if we were to be training people for the latest, then they wouldn't learn the latest by the time everything came. By the time they came into the workforce anyway.
Yeah, that's totally on point with where I was going to go with that too, because there is this idea that schools should be preparing people for practice, and to all of your points, technology or specific programs probably aren't the right answer to that. Like, students can learn what they need to for each project that they do, and that could be a different recipe depending on what they're doing, right? I mean, not every software, even though this is how it kind of plays out, is good at everything, right? Like certain programs are better for certain verticals in architecture than others, but a lot of these programs try to be everything to everyone. And therefore, to your point, you can kind of tell what software that building was designed in because of how it looks, right? A lot of times. But to kind of go beyond that, when you talk about what a firm actually wants from students, it's crazy to me that the first question is, what software do you know? Right? Because that's where they want to plug them in as a, fresh designer that's entering the profession, is just being an operator of some said program that they happen to use. But the why that's crazy is because, like, if they do know a software particularly well, I guarantee you it's not to the standards that the firm has, if they have standards, right? So, I mean, there's a caveat there, but larger firms definitely have standards, and smaller ones probably don't. It's more Wild West, but I would say even in larger firms, it's still pretty Wild West. And if you throw a student in there with basically YouTube experience of learning software, they're going to bring all kinds of bad habits into your firm. And it doesn't make sense for that to be the first question, right? And I think a lot of times it is first question, unless it's like a very specific role for something else like design. Maybe they don't care as much. And to your point, students, beyond everybody else who's already in the firm, can learn that stuff faster than anybody else. Like, they're so capable of learning things quickly, especially at that stage of their career, that it makes sense to plug them in at that point to either learn the ways of the firm or to learn the latest, greatest, or where the firm is going.
Of course. I mean, if you listener were to kind of close your eyes and think of the people in your firm, you would recognize that great people are more than 10 times better than good people, like in terms of the value to the firm. One great person is just so much more valuable than 3 or 4 good people. And so the idea that we ought to be drafting, I'm a sports fan, and the idea that we ought to be drafting for position and not for talent, I say get the best person, period, and then coach them up. And then who cares what position they play? You just want the best person. And I think it's actually quite myopic to think that, it's just so looking forward to like the next 6 months and not to the next 2-3 years, to say we want someone who knows the software and then plug them in when maybe there's a better person who does not know that software. You get the staff you deserve. If your goal is to get people who are experienced, you get the staff you deserve. You're no better than the government, in the 80s when they used to decide who designed a federal building based on how many other federal buildings they had designed. There's no logic to that. I mean, so that's the first problem with that approach. The second problem, like you identified, is that the students will learn it much quicker than you would anyway. They're so quick at learning this stuff, it's not even funny, and they're so patient at it too. Like, they will just sit down and go through 100 YouTube videos, and in a way that people who are mid-career just don't have the patience for. And then the third thing is that there's this kind of lamenting that I keep hearing. As recently as yesterday, I had a review in my studio, and I was talking with some people from a firm, and they were lamenting that they can't get people. And I didn't want to start quizzing them. I often do this, but I realize that doesn't go over well with people. But what I wanted to say, so I just said, I hear that a lot, that people can't, they just can't get people right now. But when I tell people in other professions that none of my students this year or last year or the year before have been flown out for a job interview, much less put up in a hotel room, much less taken out to dinner or lunch, they don't believe me. They're like, of course they do. If they're, there must be a glut. No, there's not a glut. There's a shortage of people. Well, if there's a shortage of people, why wouldn't they treat them well? And they don't think they have to, because there's always been too many architects. And so there's this tradition of like, well, I'm really busy with my work. I will interview you, but I'm going to make it clear to you, incoming person who's coming for an interview, I'm going to make it clear to you that I'm really busy, and that you're kind of ruining my day because I have a big deadline due. And I'm going to go through this process as quickly as possible. And then I'm not going to take you so much to coffee or lunch. I'm going to introduce you to other people in the office, but in the most cursory way. I'm not going to, bring them with us to coffee or lunch, because that would take their time away from their real job. And then I'm going to expect you to get out here on your own dime. And I'm not going to bring, if you're most businesses of any size, they'll bring a whole cohort out at once, 20 of them. And they'll put them up in the same hotel room, and they'll take them out to dinner together to say, look, you guys are going to be a team working together. Imagine if we can get all of you here. The fun that we just had last night in at dinner and going out for drinks afterward, we could be doing that all the time. And all that is lost on the tradition of hiring in architecture. And so if you're going to be to the students, then of course you're going to have a hard time getting students. I have no sympathy at all for the firms that are having trouble getting talent.
I agree. And I think the way I think about it is they're treated like an expense from day one. And I think anytime talent is treated like an expense rather than an investment, because that talent is actually going to make you money. It's not going to cost you money. I mean, people look at this as a salary expense, and they are going to be the fuel for your business, right? They are the ones who are going to set your business apart.
That's a really good point, Evan, because that's a totally good point, because they are, you're not hiring a marketing person where it's hard to attribute their work to exactly which client you got. And they're not a HR person or something like that. We're talking about the people you're actually billing, right? So they're billing out at whatever, $120 an hour. And so if they're good, why would you? Oh, that's a really good point. They're a profit center. They're not an expense.
Totally are. But the profession doesn't look at it like that. Let's take a quick break to share more about our sponsors. My friends, I've got a new chapter in the Avail story to tell you about, and that is the newly released version of Avail Desktop 4.3. The people behind Avail continually strive to make things easier for you. Easier to find the information you're looking for, easier to get it into your preferred application, and easier to store it in your preferred cloud storage locations. Let's face it, I think we can all agree that easier is better. But they didn't stop there. They also care about what your experience is like. So, as always, they've kept their focus on visuals with an eye toward design and ease of use. You're probably dying to hear the details of what's new. Well, who am I to get in the way? So let's get right to it. Avail Desktop 4.3 will now feel like your own custom app thanks to keycards. Keycards are data-driven and create zippy new visual ways of organizing your existing content. Think of them like pivot tables for your content. Join the Avail Desktop 4.3 party in BYOS, or bring your own storage. Now you can store and deliver your content using Autodesk's BIM 360, Microsoft's OneDrive, Microsoft SharePoint, Google Drive, Dropbox, Ignite, and others. Avail's new Dynamic Paths feature also solves the problem of accessing content using desktop connectors like Autodesk Desktop Connector. Try it today Either bug your admin to update your installation for all the new goodies, or if you aren't currently using Avail, go to getavail.com today to learn more. That's getavail.com. And now let's get back to our conversation. What's crazy, there's this endless supply of people at the door who are standing in line for this mistreatment that you're talking about. And at the same time, there's not enough people. I can't hire anybody. Why can't I hire anybody? And it's like, there's this super weird disconnect happening in the profession. And I think this is why we see so many graduates and young emerging professionals actually going into adjacent fields rather than, because they see the miserable leaders in our profession who are like, I don't want to turn out like that. I don't want to be fighting for less fee on the next project. I mean, that's not a sustainable business. Is that business even going to be here in 10 or 20 years? I'm going to go somewhere else where the hours are better, the treatment is better, I get to work from wherever I want, etc. They're not location based. There's so many other perks. And I just see a lot of that happening, especially with technology, right? People are moving into these tech fields because there's decent boundaries, there's work-life balance, they're solving interesting problems, they're moving at a fast pace. I mean, think about an architecture professional. It takes 5 years to do a building. You've experienced every design phase exactly one time after 5 years, and then you got to do it again. Why does it take so long to climb a corporate ladder? Why does it take so long to become an architect? Well, that's what it is. And you have to have a lot of patience and a lot of passion patience and passion, not only for the profession and your own career, but for the people you work with and the leadership.
I couldn't agree with you more, especially with your point about, kind of, I forgot what words you used, but giving meaning to these people. And so there's a long time problem where the folks who are, again, there's probably that 5 to 15 year people that we're training them for, they hold on to those decisions. People are really stingy with the design making process, and they don't want to give it to a new person. And they want to use the new person for their technical abilities and their speed at using software. That's really unfortunate, because a lot of the people that, I see coming through, they're amazing. They need to be given from day one design responsibilities. And, and when they are given design responsibilities, they need to be protected from that dude in the firm. And it's always a dude. It's always some old guy who's like, that won't meet code. And they don't tell the new person why it won't meet code. They don't sit them down and kind of like mentor them, like, okay, this will not meet code because let me explain to you what's happening. This is a mezzanine, but it's more than a third of the, whatever. They don't get into that. They just say that won't meet code, and it just makes them feel stupid. Of course, they don't know if it'll meet code. That's the senior person's job, is to help them take their design, if it's a good design, help them take it and see if you can try to get, capture some of what they've done and still meet code. But there's this kind of belief that, there's this stinginess. There's this kind of pull up the ladder from behind you once you get to the top.
It's architectural mansplaining, and you're right. It happens because instead of mentoring, they're protecting their position of superiority and their lock on their position in the firm. If their status, if I give away this information, you might replace me. Like, it's not. I don't think those are conscious choices, but I think they are subconscious choices, and it's kind of lizard brain type stuff.
But the truth is that because of technology, and I know this is such a cliche, but because of technology, the people who are coming through now can just do it so much better than the previous generations at their level. And so if you empower them and they have the lever that is the technology to amplify what they're doing, I just can't imagine that from a business point of view, that's a bad idea. Yeah, from an office status point of view, that may be a bad idea. And you hear people complain all the time, oh, the millennials now, they expect a lot. Yeah, because they're more valuable than you were, 20 years ago. They're more valuable to the world, to your firm, because they're better than you were. And for a given hour, they can just do more. They don't have to jump on an airplane. They can jump on a Zoom meeting. They don't have to look it up in architectural graphic standards. They can look it up in Google. They can just do more than you can. And so, yeah, they should. They have a value that's higher. And by the way, all those ads for people with 3 years experience, they can go, and after 3 years, they can go to another firm and get more money.
To your point about, that dude who is saying, that's never going to work. That won't pass code. And then not explaining why. I think, something that I see there a lot in firms with those kinds of people is it's the fault of the younger person for not knowing what they don't know. And that to me makes zero sense, because that's a flip of the educational system. The educational system, there's all kinds of grace, and there's all kinds of, not always. There's no grace in a lot of the final presentations with the jury, right? Who steps in, who hasn't been through the whole process with them, who is judging it with that first time they're seeing it. And they're saying, well, why didn't you do this? Like, obviously students get some experience in this along the way. But again, like, for the most part, the educational system is like, it's a fostering of, here's how we do it. Here's why we do it like this. Here are the things you should be thinking of. And can we cover it all? Nope, we can't. And then when you become a graduate and you go into a firm and you don't know what you don't know, and somebody's blaming you for that, without taking the responsibility to further the education, because we all know that it takes a long time to become an architect, period. It takes longer than the 5 years in school, period. It doesn't matter if you're licensed or not, right? If you get licensed right out of school, does that make you a great architect? No way. Would I want you designing my building? Probably not. But at the same time, like, that isn't the marker of everything now, right? And so most people take a long time to become licensed, and it is this continual learning process of being an architect. I wish that was just more accepted by those dudes out there who just complain about people and do nothing about educating them to get them to the next level, to get them to become their own replacement. I mean, we see so many positions in firms where there is no one in the pipeline because of people like that. They've never tried to make that job interesting or exciting or anything, because, like, specifications is a good example, right? Who wants to become a specifier as an architectural graduate? Raise your hands. Like, nobody in the audience is raising their hands. I don't see any hands going up. And it's like, what are we doing about that as a profession, right? And it's probably that crotchety dude in the corner who doesn't like talking to people, for the most part. I'm generalizing, but that's not true for everybody. So don't get the wrong idea. But I don't know, a little bit of a rant there. But I think, we do eat our young, and there's not a high intention to get people to the next spot and teach them what they don't know along the way.
I think most of us have the memory of a goldfish, and don't remember what it was like not to know. And they say, oh, you didn't learn that at your other firm, or you didn't learn that in school. And man, 12 years ago, I was the program chair of the site. Well, I did that for like 4 years, but 12 years ago, as the program chair here at Virginia Tech, it's the end of the fall semester, and I booked 2 meetings. I said, okay, there's an Indian restaurant buffet around the corner. And so I said, okay, I told the second year faculty, we're going to meet at 11 to 12, and we'll talk about the semester. And kind of, I wanted to talk only about big picture ideas, because, you get all involved in, like, where's the extension cord? Like, so much of day to day becomes that. I said, I don't want to talk about any logistics. I just want to talk about kind of, broad strategies and big ideas. And then I booked, so 11 to 12 was them, and I just stayed there at the buffet. It's a good thing I have a big appetite. And then from 12 to 1, I met with the third year faculty. And so the entire conversation with the second year faculty is, listen, we could do our job so much better if you talk to the first year faculty and you told them how to do line weight and how to do a plan, and how to understand how an elevation works and so forth, right? I'm like, okay, and I'm taking notes, right? Like, all right, talk to first year faculty, and then I sit down. Where this is going. I sit down with the third year faculty who populate the same seats an hour later, and they're like, man, we could do our job so much better if the second year faculty could actually teach them how to site a building, and kind of how a structural party works and so forth, and so. So everyone has this kind of inclination. Everyone has a romantic and completely misremembered idea of when they learn certain things. And even if they remember that, oh, when I graduated from school, I knew that for sure. Sure, okay, maybe you knew that better than the next generation, but you didn't know this, and they know this. You don't know what they know that you don't know. That's ridiculous.
Yeah, it would never be a two-way conversation.
Right, right, exactly. So hire smart people and give them authority and leave them alone to do a good job. And and frankly, if they're not doing a good job, fire them, please. Like, we don't need any bad people in our profession. Let's get rid of the ones. People are way, way, way too slow to fire people who are not good. And they're way, way too interested in hiring people based on their experience instead of based on their drive and talent and smarts.
Yeah, yeah, those are two very different intentions. So this idea of it's always somebody else's fault, I think that does come up a lot. It comes up a lot. I mean, not only between those years of education, but also in practice as well. It's like, how come somebody else didn't prepare them for what we do? And meanwhile, they're not preparing anybody for what they do. And it is somebody else's fault. Yeah, not my job. I see that all the time. So
yeah, I think it's important to have mentors who are younger than you. Many of my mentors are younger than me. I think it's important. They know stuff I don't know.
Yeah, that's cool. So I mean, you have, I don't know, let's call it a luxurious position of teaching young people.
I do. It is the best job. It's the best job.
So I mean, and I see why people want to be teachers. I mean, yeah, those ideas are flowing, and that's a great spot to be for sure. So tell us about your work and what you're doing with Amber Book and what that, as far as licensure goes and preparing people for licensure. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are, kind of big picture on licensure, preparing people for that, what that kind of rite of passage is like for emerging professionals today.
Yeah, so the Amber Book is a visual animated. It's not a book; it's a course. It does have a book. It comes with a 375-page illustrated book, but it's a course for folks who are studying licensure and trying to work their way specifically through the 6 ARE exams. It's an animated course. We've spent over $1 million on animation to make it so that architects in particular, but really anyone, everyone's a visual learner, right? I mean, this idea that architects are visual learners is very self-serving for us because we see ourselves that way. But I don't know anyone who ever looked at a graph and said, "Can you please put that back in a table form? I just want to see rows and columns of numbers." So the idea is that we want to have authentic and visual and ownership of content, and we want to have long-term recall of that content over time. We very much teach to the test. We're not shy about that. We aim to be the quickest path to licensure and the kind of the highest likelihood of passing the exam in the least amount of time studying. But our super secret plan is to make better buildings. We don't tell people that because people don't want a vitamin; they want a painkiller. So we provide the painkiller, but we try to make it useful for their career also, even though we do teach to the test.
That's interesting. So I assume this ties a lot into your teaching building science at Virginia Tech as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a separate consulting gig. And frankly, 100% of the benefit goes from Amber Book to Virginia Tech, not the other way around. I'm very careful I'm in my Amber Book office right now. I'm on my Amber Book computer. I try not to mix them, but I do provide Virginia Tech students with the Amber Book for free as a course textbook. The videos are free as a course textbook, and I use it for, not just for me, for all the faculty, and I've gotten the opportunity to kind of get much closer to the profession in terms of helping my students get jobs and just kind of understanding when you when you were talking about authority having jurisdiction. I know what you're talking about, not because of my work at Virginia Tech, but because of my work at Amber Book, and so I can bring those ideas back into the academy. I can bring the ideas from the profession into the academy. But it's so much fun.
So
it's so much fun.
You said you teach to the test, and I'm just wondering about your thoughts about licensure in general. Then, because like your super secret is to get architects to be able to build or design better buildings, and yet you are teaching to this test,
right? So
I know there's a disconnect there,
right? Of course, right? So so what we do is, when I say we teach to the test, what I mean is we've all. Just about everyone here has taken the test or is taking the test. If you call Amber Book for customer service, you get architects. You get people who graduate from architecture school are either taking the test or have passed them all. And those are the same people who are making the content. They're animators also, and so they're taking the test or animating the concept. So we're covering the concepts that are relevant to the exam. And that's what I mean by we're teaching to the test. We're not covering topics generally we're not covering them in depth. And when we are, we're saying you can skip this if you're in a hurry, right? So, for instance, from an energy point of view, air tightness is extraordinarily important in a building. A leak, you're in California, right? So it's not as big a deal for you, but for people who live in normal places, where it's humid outside or it's freezing outside, people who don't live in places that are magical like that, it's really important how much air leaks in, and it is not unusual for one. You can do a building here in the mountains, the cold mountains. You can do a building in a cold climate that is 20 times less leaky than my building. So that's not unusual. The different, it is if we both insulate our buildings, mine may be 20% more insulated, but yours may be 20 times less leaky. And so it's a huge deal, and it requires detailing and an understanding of construction supervision and an understanding of how products work, and especially how the seams of buildings work to make this work, and to make a building airtight. Well, the exam doesn't know that yet. And so we will cover that stuff, but we don't cover it as much as insulation because the exam knows about insulation. And so we will overcover things that are on the exam. And yeah, I mean, the exam is not aligned with, in my opinion, my exam is not well aligned with what an architect should know. And you may disagree with me on this one, but the exam is way overweighted towards pro practice. I mean, way overweighted. The idea that 50% of the questions you're going to find on the exam are pro practice is insane, especially because they're only asking about the same 100 topics over and over again. So how many times can you ask someone, a question to see whether or not they know not to talk to the mason, as an architect, to tell the mason, how much water to add to their mix? Like, there's only so many ways you can ask that. Just ask it once, and that's enough. And so, and if people will say, oh, well, to protect the life, the life, safety, and welfare of the public, we need to be able to understand these things, these kind of, project delivery methods. And that's bullshit. I mean, the physicians aren't tested on how to bill, for their license. They're not tested on how to bill, insurance companies, even though that's a lot of their work. And so the argument has always been, and adding all this pro practice has been, well, we as architects are spending a lot of time understanding contracts. So because I'm spending a lot of time doing that in my day to day, I think that architects ought to know that. That's like, to me, that's like a pilot saying, why do I have to spend so much time learning about takeoffs and landings when I'm spending most of the time at 35,000 feet? And the answer is, of course, because we ought to be tested on not what we're doing the most of. We ought to be tested on what is the most important things we're doing, the things that give us value. And the fact that we know contracts, or that we know the types of delivery, to the extent that we do, I'm not saying it shouldn't be any part of the exam, but maybe 90-10 or 85-15, not 50-50. This is crazy to me. And this is something that NCARB has done intentionally. They have intentionally brought this stuff forward. And so, so we'll cover more on AHJs, and we'll cover more on, on what a mezzanine, what constitutes a mezzanine or whatever, because that's what's going to be on the exam. But we're most excited about, how do you get your design intent out without having to worry about the code or the materiality, or, how do you make something that's beautiful now, but also beautiful in like 20 years? Like, how, if we're talking about warping, if it's going to warp, let's talk about it now so we can understand it.
Yeah, and how it can make an impact in the positive for the future of not only the profession but the communities that those projects end up in, right? Like thinking beyond the phases, the earliest phases of a project that an architect's involved in, and then what, right? And it's like, okay, next project, right? That's how architects are trained. That's how they actually do it. But to increase the lifespan or the long view of the architect, it has to happen everywhere. It has to happen in education. It has to happen during licensure as well, and it has to happen during practice. That's a tough shift to make.
Yeah. So how would you do it if you were? Let me flip the microphone around. As someone with a deep practice background, like, how would you do that?
I think that there's a larger pressure. I think Spark spoke about pressure earlier from various individuals, but there is a larger pressure to go deeper into everything now. And I'm not sure, because to me, the answer cannot always be do more. I don't see how that's possible. Um, so there is more pressure to know a lot.
Hold on. You mean the architect do more to learn, or the architect do more to design, or something else?
It's everything. It's to learn about all. So I recently attended a lecture by Phil Bernstein online, and he was talking about slavery in material manufacturing, right? And so there's kind of this idea that the architect, by making a decision to use zinc paneling on a project, is basically ensuring that slavery happens. Right. And not knowing, right. Again, no fault. They don't know what they don't know. We don't know what we don't know, but that is what is actually happening in the world. So now it's like, how can we know things like that? How can we go deeper to understand these bigger things that are going on environmentally, right? Energy, slavery, material production, red listing, all of these things, right? You even said it like the passive house. How can you go deeper in all of these slots as an architect? Is the answer always do more? I don't know what that answer is, because I don't see how any one of the systems in the way that they're set up now enable us to be better at any of this in the future. Like, we've got contracts, we've got insurance, we've got legal, we've got AHJs, codes. Every state has a different energy code. Every jurisdiction has a different energy code. I mean, it's kind of crazy making to think, like, again, how do these projects even ever get done? I don't know the answer how that happens, but these are all real pressures on an architect. And so, there's that famous quote by Buckminster Fuller, which I don't have up in front of me, but it's like, you can't fix what's already there. You have to like make it obsolete by inventing a new way to do it. And so I don't know who's willing to roll up their sleeves to make the new way to do it.
Well, maybe this is back to our conversation a little while ago where we were talking about, if BIM knows that you're putting zinc, then maybe Clippy, remember Clippy from Microsoft Word, the little paper clip that would come in and make suggestions, right? Maybe Clippy says, we support zinc, but you should know that if you do zinc, you're promoting slavery. It's like, this would be the kind, this is a great, not to be an unapologetic techno optimist, but this is a great role for technology, because then one person doesn't have to know it all. If you're telling the software what the material is, then the material ought to give you an ESG back. Like one of your more recent podcasts was talking about that aspect.
Well, that absolutely is true. And I think, Phil was a big part of the development at Autodesk of kind of the big ideas of what BIM could or should be. And you talked about earlier how it took a long time to start delivering on those promises. But that is exactly what the kind of thing that we're talking about here is like, if you can tie all of these systems together and all this knowledge together from the disparate sources into the one thing that can then proactively alert you to some of the implications of the decisions that you're making at whatever stage that is along the process, that is a huge benefit. Because then once you know, even if you're not the person to make a decision about it, you can raise that up in conversation with the owner, right? Which is one of Phil's points. Like, you think that this makes the most sense for XYZ reasons. Now let's have a conversation about it so that everybody knows what's involved in making this decision. Maybe it's not everything, but it's deeper than the surface which we scratch right now.
That's our goal, man. Let's get deeper than the surface that we scratch now. I'm going to put that on a t-shirt. Or that should be on everyone's diploma.
So how are you, you're alluding to it, but maybe you could be more specific. How are you actually getting the architects educated to design better buildings?
In terms of the practicing architects, it's a matter of technical competence is a huge part of it. So just kind of, there's a lot to understand in architecture. And so covering technical competence in a way that's digestible and fun and easy to understand and memorable, that's a big part of it. That includes, but not limited to, low energy buildings, well daylit buildings, quiet buildings where they need to be quiet, and reverberant buildings where they need to be reverberant, and so forth. I didn't set out to do this, but I do feel like there has been, just from kind of talking to people, I do feel like in some people who take the course, take the Amber Book course, there's an awakened curiosity that goes beyond what they're learning in the course. So, people will say, I'm starting to do what you do and pull over at all the construction sites and, and break in the way you break in and, that kind of thing. And just kind of being aware to kind of see, okay, this is the smoke baffle. This is oh, that's why they did this. Just so, one of the things that we have, and anyone, any architect who's ever traveled with a partner who's not an architect can attest. The partner who's not an architect, because there's a lot of kind of bitching and moaning about all the crap that an architect has to deal with. But there's some amazing things that we should probably point out too, right? So one is, I would think that if I wasn't an architect, traveling with an architect is the most fun thing ever, unless you don't want to be stuck in the same building for, an hour and a half while they sketch it. But I mean, if you have the independent wherewithal to be able to leave that architect, if there's an understanding that, when they start sketching, you can leave for a few hours and go to a cafe, I think it's amazing because the world is our field trip. And so just the idea that we can kind of go out there and not just the beautiful buildings, but the ugly ones too. Like, okay, that building is ugly. Why is it ugly? It's ugly because it's striped. Why is it striped? Because there's spandrel glass that looks nothing like the other glass. Okay, like I'll have to remember that. And next time I talk to my glass guy, and this goes to your day job at Tech, next time I talk to my glass guy, I need to make sure that I understand how to make my curtain wall not look striped. And so I think that there's a lot to be learned from this shitty stuff too. But just kind of actually just being able to travel and go to a theater and, this is even if you don't know a lot about architectural history, you can just start like lapping it up. Look what they did, And so, I think being an architect, I think that frankly, I think architects complain a little too much. I think it's really awesome. Like you can leave the profession and you don't have to stay. You can get more money and work more normal hours as a rep for a window manufacturer, and that's fine. But you're making a choice to kind of be in the mix. And just because architects are golden retrievers and so happy to have, be given the right to help out in a building and just happy to take whatever fee we can, yeah, that sucks. And we need to change that for sure. But that doesn't mean that it's not just the best profession. And yeah, it takes 5 years to get a building done, but it takes 75 years before it comes down. Like that's amazing, right? The software that you were comparing it to, that's going to be obvious. Yeah, that's good decisions. The software that you're comparing it to is amazing because you can get it done probably quicker, but software takes a while too. And then you have to support it. After you're done with a building, you don't have to answer questions for it and you don't have to make updates for it and protect it from hackers. And then it's obsolete in 4 years. Or if you're lucky. And so what an amazing thing to be in this profession. What a very cool thing. And there is, frankly, in some parts of the country, not all, there is a cool factor too. There is a status role that architects play, and people are happy to, invite an architect to a dinner party. I think we're like the best people to have around. And so I am very bullish on architecture. I am bearish on commodity architecture. I don't think that there's a place for it because it will be shipped overseas if folks in the Philippines, if you're not bringing design to the table, I mean, design, capital D, I mean, all the things that your professors told you about, you could have said, I think there was a time 30 years ago where you could have mumbled to yourself, yeah, this professor who's all into design, I'm not into design. Once I get in practice, it won't be all about design. It'll be okay. That may have been true before. But if someone in the Philippines can draw it, then you're going to have firms, and you're already seeing this, where there's 5 people in the US and 50 in the Philippines, and the 5 in the US are meeting the clients, and the 50 in the Philippines are doing the design work, and the 5 in the US are kind of, stamping the drawings. And I don't see a place for you. If you don't love design, if you're not into this profession, there's not good money in it, and there's not going to be a place for you anyway in a few years because it'll be outsourced, I think. Hope I'm wrong.
There's the idea of commodity buildings, right? But then there's also the idea of commodity tasks inside an architecture firm too, that automation should be vacuuming up, because those jobs aren't going to be things that they shouldn't be things that we're competing on anyway, right? If we can't compete with the Philippines, we can't compete with a machine either, right? That's going to be able to do it faster, better, more accurately than we could do it. And I just think, again, like this reinforces your point of like this kind of design. That's where the value of an architect actually is in that the ability to have those ideas, synthesize those thoughts into reality, take something from like utter chaos, right, which is a wicked design problem, and make it into reality, that right there is the value of an architect. So do there need to be as many of us out there? I don't know that the answer is yes. I think.
I mean, if there is one single reason, and there is one single reason why architects are paid low relative to what most people think we're paid or what other professions are paid, is because there's 10% too many of us. And so anytime there's 10% too many, the price plummets. We saw what happened, when there's 10% too few after the pandemic, when there's 10% too many during the pandemic, when there's 10% too many during the housing crisis. During the recession, there's 10% too many houses for sale in your neighborhood, then the price of your neighborhood doesn't go 10% down. The price of a house in your neighborhood goes down, 70% because it's a race to the bottom. And so as long as architects are seen, and rightly so, as Kleenex, where you pull one out and there's another one there, I don't think it's incumbent upon the architects to do something to necessarily add value. I think, frankly, we ought to do what the medical AMA does for doctors. The reason doctors are paid so high in America, not just relative to architects, but relative to doctors anywhere else in the world, is because the AMA limits the number. They control the number of slots in medical schools, and so if the AIA wanted to control the number of slots in architecture schools, the way the AMA controls the number of slots in medical schools, then architects would likely be paid what doctors are paid, or certainly way more than they're paid now. But the idea that we as a profession are doing something wrong because we're not valuing ourselves or something like that. I mean, there's probably some truth to that. Because we are golden retrievers who are just so happy to be part of the project that we don't, we do it for free. But that's part of it. But that's because the job is cool. Like, it's a fun job. But it's ignoring the market forces involved, and the fact that I don't know, I made up that number, 10%. I don't know if there's 5% or 20% too many, but there are definitely far too many architects. Relative to, right now things are good, and it's been like that for 12 years. But there's no reason to think it'll be like that forever. There's actually a lot of reason to think it won't be like that forever.
Right. There's two questions that I ask, and it might be just two versions of the same question, but it's like, what do we owe the future of this profession? Like, do we want it to? The other question is, does it deserve to exist? And so what are people who are in practice now, working with licensure, working with education, doing to prepare for that future rather than the jobs that we've had before, right? There's got to be something that says, like, we are valuable. We have to decide that for ourselves before anybody else will do it for us or to us, right? So what are we doing to make sure that happens? And I don't see a lot of action. Like you said, this is the coolest job in the world. We should freaking act like it, right? Like this, if it really is, we should act like it. And yet, like, most of the things that I see architects do is complaining about the way things are. And yet here we are responsible for that exact same thing.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the other thing that's kind of, the 300-pound gorilla that's there that could totally upend everything is there may be a time when building a building is seen in the same way as buying a Hummer. In terms of, once the public figures out the carbon footprint of architecture and the wild differences between one building and another, and I'm not just talking about the stupid way we measure it right now, which is only to measure it on EUI or how much energy per square feet, because that's a little bit bogus. Because maybe you don't need a new building, or you need a building half the size, right? But architects are kind of sheepish about saying that because this is our livelihood. But when people figure out when the public, and it's happening in real time, when they figure out how much carbon our buildings are putting up there, you could imagine a scenario where people feel the same way about a new building that they feel about a new factory, or about some gas guzzling entity. It's going to be interesting. I think we'll solve the electricity grid problem before that happens. It looks like. I mean, there's a huge change going on right now that probably many of your listeners are aware of, and so things are changing in terms of our energy is getting clean, so it may not be an issue. But man, it almost was a big issue. We almost put ourselves out of business.
You know how there's like Twitter accounts for there was somebody set up a robot to automatically tweet when certain people were flying their private planes all over the place to trace their carbon footprint.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah, so they're like, they're legislators, they're lawmakers, whatever, and they're fighting against climate change and putting these carbon laws into effect. And at the same time, they're doing like 200 flights a year or 40 flights a month or whatever, flying to all their different. So it was just like pointing out the hypocrisy. Like I could totally see that for buildings, right? Like some student could just be like, let's expose the hypocrisy so that we actually see some change in this industry, and let's have all these buildings just self-report whatever the carbon emissions that are coming out in real time.
Yeah, and I'm really not looking for good corporate citizenship. I want to see good corporate governance. Like I want to see rules, because otherwise whoever doesn't follow the rules wins, right? So, I mean, whoever doesn't follow the norms, it can't be a norm, right? If it's a norm, the person who doesn't follow the norm won't have to report their carbon. And so they're going to win because they're going to be able to do it cheaper. And they're going to be able to set the thermostat cooler in the summer and hotter in the winter and, that kind of thing. There has to be good governance. There has to be rules that everybody plays by, because then there's a level playing field. And, every other time those rules have existed, that's when things change. Things don't change because people, ought to do the right thing. We saw that with the pandemic. There's lots of things people ought to do. They never did it. But once, but if there's, but once, so it's, the things that have gotten us out of trouble before are making rules that are smart and innovation and technology that gets us out of a hole. But expecting people to do the right thing or pointing out hypocrisy. I mean, man, I'm an environmentalist. I'm wearing a sweatshirt in here because I keep the thermostat way down. People make fun of me because I usually have my coat on and a hat. So when I'm on a Zoom meeting, people make fun of me, and I'm like, well, I just turned down the thermostat. But you know what? I take really long hot showers, and so my colleagues are probably, like, what the hell? You say you're an environmentalist, you keep the thermostat, you make us all wear coats, and then you take a long hot showers, and so it's very difficult to find people who are consistent. And I'm all for inconsistent people making rules that once they're adopted make, or innovate, or inconsistent people innovating or whoever innovating to fix these problems, because they're really, really serious problems. And you will always find people who are hypocrites. Like in any, it doesn't mean in any movement, and it doesn't mean the movement is not, it doesn't mean the movement's not virtuous just because there's hypocrites involved.
Is there anything that we missed that we still
no,
need to
man,
cover,
we covered everything. No, we covered
did.
Climate. We covered how to solve climate change. We covered how to fix the whole profession. We covered how to pass the exams. We covered how to make beautiful buildings, how to educate people. There's literally, I can't think of anything important that we did not cover. So no, I think we're good.
Podcasting gold this episode.
That's right. You're going to have to go back and listen to it again.
Right. Well, Michael, as always, fantastic seeing you, having this conversation. So I'm sure we'll talk again soon.
Oh, good to talk to you, Evan.
Thank you to Avail for their support of this podcast episode. Visit getavail.com to see their holistic approach to content management today. This show is part of the Gabled Media Podcast Network. You can see all the shows at gabledmedia.com. That's GABLMEDIA.com. You can help support what I'm doing here by leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts to help get the word out, and of course, share it with your friends. I'd love to hear from you, so leave a comment on the website at trxl.co/podcast, where you can find every episode. You can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram and YouTube. Just search for E. Troxel. Talk to you soon.